My name is Daniel Voss. I am 34 years old. On June 14th, 2014, at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, my mother handed my brother Kyle a check for $42,000 at our kitchen table while I sat 3 feet away eating a sandwich I had made myself because no one had offered me lunch. The check was for Kyle's honeymoon. The memo line read, "Family Trip Fund." I know because I read it upside down the way I have read thousands of documents upside down across conference tables for the past 11 years. That number, $42,000, written in my mother's architect-precise handwriting on a pale blue check from their joint account at Cornerstone Federal, sat on that table between the mustard and the napkin holder like it belonged there. Like it was ordinary, like I wasn't sitting right there. My mother didn't look at me when she slid it across. She looked at Kyle and said, "You two deserve this, after everything." I set my sandwich down. I pressed my thumb into the edge of the table until the wood grain printed itself into my skin. I didn't move. I was already running numbers I hadn't asked myself to run. 9 summers, 9 plane tickets I was never handed, 9 resort bills that now had a shape. The math wasn't hard. The math had never been hard. I just hadn't let myself finish the equation until that afternoon. Noted. That was their 4th disbursement to Kyle that year alone. I had logged the first 3 without naming what I was doing. Before I lay out what I found and what it cost them when I did, I want to know something. What time is it where you are? I've learned to note the time of things. It matters more than people realize. My name is Daniel Voss, and I am a forensic accountant specializing in estate and trust fraud. For 11 years I have sat in rooms where families come apart at the seams over money, and my job has been to find where the dollars actually went when someone claims they went somewhere else. I trace fund flows the way a bloodhound traces scent, routing numbers, disbursement schedules, beneficiary designations, the author fields in digitally created documents, the metadata timestamps that tell you when a file was actually made versus when someone claims it was made. I catch things because numbers don't perform. Numbers don't smile at you over dinner and say everything is equal. Numbers just sit there and tell the truth whether anyone wants to hear it or not. That skill had exposed 14 cases of elder financial abuse and recovered over $6 million in misappropriated trust funds across a decade of depositions. It was about to audit my own family. I need to go back. The summers are the architecture, and without the architecture, the $42,000 check is just one ugly afternoon instead of the capstone of a system. My parents are Robert and Janet Voss. My father was a regional sales director for a building materials distributor. My mother managed properties, 4 rental units she inherited from her father, and she ran them with a clipboard and a color-coded filing system that would embarrass most of my professional colleagues. Kyle is 2 years older. I am the younger son. And from the summer I turned 7 until the summer I turned 15, my parents sent me to stay with my Aunt Ruth in Decatur, Illinois, every June through August, so that Kyle could have what my mother called dedicated family experiences. The first summer, 1997, Kyle had just finished a brutal year of anxiety treatment, therapy twice a week, a brief hospitalization in April. I remember almost nothing of his illness because I was 5 during the worst of it, but I grew up inside the aftermath the way you grow up inside a house. You don't notice the walls. The walls are just where you live. By the time Kyle was 10, he was stable, medicated, monitored, but stable. The annual vacations, my mother explained, were therapeutic, bonding experiences, low-stimulation environments where Kyle could feel safe and centered. The implication, never stated directly but embedded in every logistical decision, was that my presence was the stimulation. That I was the variable being removed for Kyle's benefit. Incident 1. Summer 1997. I was 7. My mother packed my bag on a Wednesday and drove me to Decatur on Thursday. She told me Aunt Ruth missed me terribly and this would be an adventure. I asked if Kyle was coming. She said Kyle needed quiet time with Mom and Dad. 3 weeks later, a photo arrived in Aunt Ruth's mailbox, my parents and Kyle on a catamaran in the Virgin Islands. My mother's handwriting on the back. "Wish you could see this water." Ruth put it in a drawer without showing me. I found it in October when I was looking for batteries. Incident 2. Summer 1999. I was 9. Destination, a dude ranch in Montana. Kyle was by then 12 and had not had a therapeutic appointment in 14 months. I asked that year if I could come to Montana. I asked at dinner on a Tuesday in May. My mother put her fork down with a precision that meant we were done eating. Daniel, your brother needs this. You understand that. You've always understood that. My father said nothing. He was reading the sports section. He turned a page. I understood. Incident 3 through 9 followed the same mechanical sequence. Bag packed, car loaded, 5 hours to Decatur. Aunt Ruth's brick house with the cracked front step she never fixed. The smell of her lavender detergent and the sound of the window unit in the spare bedroom that cycled on and off all night like a metal heartbeat. And then sometime in July, a photograph would arrive. Hilton Head, Lake Tahoe, Yellowstone, Banff, the Outer Banks, each one a family portrait with 3 people in it. The snort's irony beat lands here, because it has to. I spent those summers in Ruth's spare bedroom reading her dead husband's accounting textbooks because there was nothing else in the house for a kid my age, and they were at least full of puzzles. I taught myself double-entry bookkeeping at 11 years old from a 1978 Kiso textbook with a cracked spine. By 13, I was reconciling Ruth's household budget for her on graph paper at the kitchen table while she watched her programs. I built my entire career on the skills I developed in exile. The profession that would eventually dismantle my family's fiction was born in the room they sent me to so they could pretend I didn't exist for 10 weeks a year. The tool was forged in the punishment. I don't know what to do with that except say it out loud and keep going. Ruth herself was a quiet woman. My father's older sister, widowed at 41, childless. She worked the front desk at a Holiday Inn Express and came home smelling like industrial carpet cleaner and complimentary breakfast syrup. She was not unkind to me. She fed me. She left me alone. She did not pretend the situation was anything other than what it was. Once, the summer I was 12, I asked her why Kyle couldn't come too. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "Your mother has her reasons. I don't agree with all of them." Then she went back to her crossword. That was the most direct statement anyone in my family made about the arrangement for 8 years. I filed it in a drawer that wouldn't open for a long time. After high school, I left for the University of Illinois. Chose it because it was 40 minutes from Ruth's house, which says something I didn't examine until years later. I studied accounting, then forensic accounting. Then I moved to Denver for a position at a firm that specialized in trust litigation, and I built a life that had nothing to do with Ohio. I called home on holidays. I visited at Christmas if the flight was cheap. I functioned as a family member the way a satellite functions as part of a solar system, technically in orbit, practically alone. Kyle, meanwhile, moved back to our parents' suburb, married Heather in 2013, took a position at our father's distributor, where the name Voss opened doors that would have required a battering ram for anyone else. And my parents funded his life with a consistency that I registered but never examined because examining it would have required me to name what I was seeing, and naming it would have made 9 summers real in a way I was not ready for. Then came the check, June 14, 2014. $42,000 on the kitchen table, and something in me went still in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the part of my brain that activates when a ledger doesn't balance. I didn't say anything that afternoon. I finished my sandwich. I drove back to the airport. I flew home to Denver, and that night, at my desk with a legal pad and a pen, I started doing what I do. I started an audit. Then I found something else. I called Cornerstone Federal the following Monday. I identified myself as a beneficiary of the Voss Family Trust, which I was, technically. My grandfather had established it in 1989, with my father and his sister Ruth as co-trustees. The trust was supposed to provide equally for all grandchildren upon reaching age 25. I had received my disbursement in 2015, $18,000. I had assumed Kyle received the same. The account officer couldn't give me specifics over the phone, but she could confirm the total disbursements to date against the trust's original corpus. The number she gave me didn't match what 2 equal $18,000 payments would produce. It was short by $67,000. That was layer 1. The obvious surface, an imbalance that could have been fees, could have been investment losses, could have been anything, but $67,000 is not a rounding error. and I knew, with the certainty of 11 years tracing fund flows, that this number had a name attached to it. I just needed to find the paperwork. I requested the trust's annual accountings. As a named beneficiary, I had a legal right to them. They arrived 3 weeks later in a manila envelope from the trust's attorney, Gerald Koff, a man my father had golfed with for 20 years. I spread them across my dining table, 12 annual statements, and I read them the way I read every document. Not for what they say, for what they don't say. The disbursement schedule showed my $18,000 payment in 2015 and Kyle's $18,000 payment in 2013. Equal, clean, accounted for. But the trust's operating expenses told a different story. Between 2005 and 2014, the trust had paid $67,400 in what were categorized as educational and therapeutic enrichment expenses for Kyle Voss. Summer programs, the document said, therapeutic travel, developmental enrichment. I went still again. My coffee was in my hand and I did not drink it. I did not set it down. I held it at the exact height it was when the number registered, and I stood there in my kitchen for what felt like a very long time. Something inside me was running calculations I had not authorized. 9 summers, 9 trips. Average cost per trip if you divided $67,400 by 9, $7,489. That was almost exactly what a week at a mid-range resort costs for a family of 3 plus airfare. The trust had been paying for the family vacations I was excluded from. My grandfather's money, designated for all grandchildren equally, had funded 9 years of trips that required my absence as a condition of their existence. I was excluded from the experiences, and I was paying for them. My inheritance subsidized my own abandonment. Then I found something else. The educational and therapeutic enrichment invoices in the trust file were submitted on letterhead from something called Bright Horizon Developmental Services. I had never heard of this organization. I searched for it. No website, no state registration, no licensing with the Ohio Department of Mental Health. The phone number on the letterhead connected to a fax line that produced a generic carrier tone. I pulled the PDF properties on the scanned invoices. The author field read, J. Voss do A. Say DB. My mother's computer. The creation dates on 6 of the 9 invoices were within 48 hours of the corresponding trust disbursement requests. She wasn't submitting invoices from a provider. She was creating them. The document that made everything before it irrelevant wasn't the invoices. It was the trust amendment. Filed quietly in 2004, 1 year before the summer trips began, signed by my father as trustee with my Aunt Ruth's signature on the co-trustee line. The amendment added a provision allowing disbursements for therapeutic enrichment of beneficiaries at the trustee's discretion, without requiring beneficiary notification. Not because it was worse than fabricated invoices, because it was first. The amendment came before the trips, before the invoices, before the suitcase. The system was designed before the first summer I was sent away. Architectural, intentional, the way my mother plans everything, with a clipboard and color-coded tabs. But Ruth's signature on that amendment, that was the part one couldn't reconcile. Ruth, who had housed me. Ruth, who had said, I don't agree with all of them. Ruth, who had watched me read accounting textbooks at her kitchen table for 9 summers while the trust she co-signed was paying for trips I was barred from attending. I called her on a Thursday evening. I didn't plan what to say. I said, Ruth, I need to ask you about the 2004 trust amendment. The silence on her end lasted long enough for me to hear her television in the background, a game show, someone spinning a wheel. I wondered when you'd find that, she said. Your father told me it was for Kyle's therapy expenses, medical things the insurance didn't cover. I didn't read it carefully. I should have read it carefully. She paused. Then, how bad is it, Daniel? $67,000, I said. Fabricated invoices. Fake provider. The money went to family vacations. I heard her set something down. Glass on wood. All 9 years? All 9 years? She didn't speak for a while. Then she said, I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. My parents' house in Westerville has a formal dining room they use exactly twice a year, Thanksgiving and Christmas Eve. The table seats 12. The chandelier is Austrian crystal, purchased during a European trip in 2011, a trip I learned about through a Facebook photo 2 weeks after they returned. The room has built-in china cabinets with glass doors, and every piece inside was chosen by my mother. She calls that room her sanctuary. The walls are a specific shade of sage green she had custom mixed 4 times before she was satisfied. I chose Thanksgiving. I arrived the morning of, carrying a folder, thin, manila, the kind you'd barely notice on a counter. Ruth drove down from Decatur separately. She hadn't been to a Voss Thanksgiving in 3 years, and when my mother opened the door and saw her, there was a flicker of something unscripted across her face before the hostess mask resettled. Dinner was the full production: turkey, 3 sides, the Austrian crystal catching candlelight. Kyle and Heather across from me, their daughter Maddie in a high chair, mashing sweet potato with both fists. My father at the head, his carving knife moving with the ceremonial precision of a man who believes this meal proves something about his life. 8 people total, including 2 of my mother's property management colleagues she'd invited to fill seats. After the plates were cleared and before dessert, my mother stood to make what she called her gratitude toast, an annual tradition where she named each person at the table and assigned them a quality she was thankful for. Kyle, our miracle. Heather, the daughter I always wanted. Maddie, our future. My father, my rock. Ruth, always dependable. Her colleagues, my dear friends. Me, our quiet strength. I let the toast finish. I let people drink. Then I said, before dessert, I need to discuss something with the family. It concerns the trust. My mother's glass paused halfway to the table. Daniel, this isn't the time. It is exactly the time. I opened the folder. I placed the first document on the table, the trust amendment from 2004, and I stated what it was and when it was filed. My father set down his napkin. Kyle looked at Heather. The 2 colleagues shifted in their chairs with the discomfort of people who have just realized they are not guests at dinner. They are witnesses to something. That amendment, I said, enabled 9 years of trust disbursements totaling $67,400 under the category of therapeutic enrichment. My mother's voice went steely and bright. Kyle's therapy was expensive. You know what he went through. I placed the second document, an invoice from Bright Horizon Developmental Services dated July 2007. This provider does not exist. It has no state registration, no licensing, no physical address. The document was created on your home computer 46 hours before the corresponding trust disbursement. That's not what happened, she said, flat, immediate. Tactic 1. I placed the third document, a side-by-side comparison of 3 invoices showing identical formatting, identical font irregularities in the header, and creation metadata from the same device across 3 separate years. You're doing this because you've always resented your brother, my mother said. Her voice had gone quiet, controlled. You've always been jealous of the attention Kyle needed. Tactic 2. Kyle's head was down. Heather had her hand on his arm. My father was staring at the trust amendment like it was a door he didn't remember opening. After everything this family has been through, my mother said, and her hand went to her chest, to the place where the words family and sacrifice live in her body. After what we survived with Kyle's illness, you would sit at this table and make accusations. Tactic 3. I waited. I placed the fourth document, the resort booking confirmation for Hilton Head, July 2007, 3 guests, Robert Voss, Janet Voss, Kyle Voss, total cost $7,200. The exact amount disbursed from the trust that same month under therapeutic enrichment. Not in front of everyone, my mother said. Her eyes went to her colleagues. This is a private family matter. Tactic 4. Image management. And then Ruth stood. She stood at the far end of that Austrian crystal dining room and she said, in a voice that was steady and factual and carried the weight of 9 summers of watching a boy read textbooks alone at her kitchen table. I co-signed that amendment in 2004. Robert told me it was for medical expenses. I believed him. I should not have believed him without reading the paperwork. I have reviewed the documents Daniel sent me last month. The invoices are fabricated. The provider does not exist. The disbursements funded family vacations from which Daniel was deliberately excluded. She looked at my mother. I'm prepared to provide a sworn statement to the trust's successor attorney. I've already retained my own counsel. The room went silent. Maddie banged her spoon on her high chair tray, once, twice, and nobody moved to stop her. I looked at my mother across that sage green room she had built to prove she had built something beautiful, and I said the one sentence I had carried for 20 years. You didn't exclude me because Kyle needed peace. You excluded me because it was easier to have a family of 3, and you used my grandfather's money to fund the version of this family that didn't include me. I did not elaborate. I closed the folder. The silence lasted long enough for the candles to move in a draft no one had noticed before. My father spoke, the first complete sentence he'd contributed all evening. I signed it, he said. Janet drafted it, and I signed it, and I knew what it was for. My mother turned to him with an expression I had never seen on her face. Not anger, betrayal. The betrayal of a co-conspirator who has just been named by their partner. He wouldn't look at her. He looked at me instead. I don't have an excuse, Daniel. I knew, and I did it anyway because she said it was simpler. The aftermath unfolded across months, the way weight settles into a structure that was never engineered to hold it. Within 2 weeks, Ruth formally filed a complaint with the trust's supervising court, citing breach of fiduciary duty. Gerald Koff, the family attorney who had administered the trust for 20 years without questioning a single fabricated invoice, resigned his position as trust counsel within the month. His malpractice carrier opened a file. In January, my father agreed to a restitution plan. $67,400 returned to the trust corpus over 3 years, sourced from the sale of one of my mother's rental properties. He signed it without argument. My mother did not sign it. She was not required to because my father was the named trustee. But she also was not speaking to him by then, which made the logistics of selling jointly owned rental property something their attorneys handled in writing. By March, Kyle called me. The conversation was 40 minutes long, and mostly silence on his end. He said he hadn't known about the trust. He said he had believed the vacations were paid from savings. He said he was sorry in a way that sounded like a man discovering his foundation is built on someone else's stolen lumber. I believed him. I also told him that believing him didn't erase the fact that for 9 years he had gone on trips without once asking where I was. He said he knew. He said he'd been telling himself I preferred Ruth's house. He said that out loud, and I could hear him hearing it for the first time, and he went quiet again. In April, Kyle did something I hadn't expected. He pulled Maddie out of the private preschool my mother had been paying for and enrolled her in the public program. When my mother objected, Kyle told her that his daughter's education would not come with conditions attached. She stopped speaking to him for 6 weeks. It was the longest she'd ever gone without an audience. Ruth and I began talking every Sunday. Short calls. She told me, during one of them, about the year I was 9, how she'd called my mother and asked if I could stay through the school year. How my mother had said, "That's not how it looks, Ruth. A nephew visiting for summer is normal. A nephew living with his aunt full-time means something went wrong." Ruth had never told me this. She'd carried it for 25 years like a stone in her coat pocket she'd forgotten how to put down. My father drove to Denver in June, alone. He sat in my apartment for 2 hours and drank coffee I made too strong and told me he'd filed for legal separation from my mother. Not because of the trust, he said, because of the 20 years of not saying anything when he should have said something. Because silence was his instrument, and he'd finally heard what it sounded like from the outside. I did not tell him it was okay. It was not okay. I told him I would see him at Christmas and that he was welcome in my home. That was what I had. It was honest. My mother retained her property portfolio minus the 1 unit sold for restitution. She retained her house. She retained her dining room with the Austrian crystal and the sage green walls. But by the following Thanksgiving, no one came to sit in it. Kyle took Heather and Maddie to her parents in Michigan. Ruth stayed in Decatur. My father spent the holiday in a furnished apartment he'd rented off Sawmill Road. I worked. I have always been comfortable working on holidays. That was the gift Decatur gave me, whether anyone intended it or not. I want to talk about what silence costs. Not the dramatic silence of secrets. The ordinary silence of watching something happen at a kitchen table and choosing to keep chewing. Ruth's silence, my father's silence. My own silence, for years, as I watched checks pass and trips happen and photographs arrive and chose to call it normal because calling it anything else would have required me to sit with a number I wasn't ready to calculate. Silence in a family operates the same way it operates in a fraudulent trust. It doesn't conceal the truth, it delays the audit, and every year the audit is delayed, the liability compounds. By the time someone finally opens the file, the deficit is so large that repair requires structural intervention, not just a conversation over coffee. I know this because I have sat in rooms where families discovered what 20 years of silence costs in dollars. The number is always larger than anyone imagined, but the deficit that matters, the one no restitution plan can address, is the years, the summers. The 9 versions of a childhood that cannot be rebuilt or returned, those are written off. That is the entry that doesn't balance. I am 34 years old. I live in Denver. I work cases that matter to me with a specificity I choose. Last March, I took on a pro bono case for a woman whose in-laws had systematically redirected her children's education trust into a business account. The children were 7 and 9. I found the discrepancy in the metadata of a single forged authorization letter. The author field showed the wrong name. It took me 4 minutes. Some patterns you recognize immediately once you've lived inside one. On my desk, in a plain frame, sits a photocopy of a check. Pale blue, Cornerstone Federal, memo line, Family Trip Fund, $42,000. I keep it there not as anger, not as trophy, as calibration, a reminder of what ordinary cruelty looks like when it sits on a kitchen table between the mustard and the napkin holder and nobody flinches. Last month, I used the first restitution payment, returned to the trust and properly disbursed to me, to book a flight, Decatur, Illinois, Ruth's brick house with the cracked front step. I sat at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning and she made coffee too weak the way she always has. And I opened the 1978 Kizo textbook that still sits on her shelf, spine held together with packing tape now, and I showed her the page I'd dog-eared at 11 years old. Chapter 9. Internal Controls. The passage about how segregation of duties prevents any single individual from controlling all aspects of a financial transaction without oversight. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "You learned that here." I said, "I learned everything here." And we sat with that for a while, in the quiet of a house that had never pretended to be more than what it was. When you watched it happen and stayed quiet, what were you protecting? Because it wasn't them. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.